In the heart of a small, quiet town, life unfolded with a predictable rhythm. The streets were lined with rows of neat houses, their lawns trimmed to perfection, and families could be seen enjoying the simplicity of their daily routines. The town, nestled between green hills and winding rivers, had a comforting familiarity to it. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else, where the shopkeeper greeted you by name and where the mail carrier waved as she passed. There were no sudden disruptions, no crimes that made the front page of the local paper. It was the kind of town that seemed to embody peace, the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary could possibly happen. Sarah Montgomery, the wife of the town's police commissioner, was well acquainted with this serenity. A woman in her early 40s, Sarah was the very picture of grace. With her soft brown hair always neatly tied back and her smile warm and inviting, she had spent much of her life in the shadow of her husband's distinguished career. John Montgomery had been the town's commissioner for over a decade, and their life together had been one of respectability, peace, and routine. As the wife of such an influential figure, Sarah was no stranger to the occasional public appearance, but she had always preferred the quiet comfort of her home, a cozy cottage just a few blocks away from Main Street. That particular morning, Sarah had no plans other than to run her usual errands. She had made a list the night before, which included picking up groceries for dinner, visiting her elderly mother who lived on the outskirts of town, and perhaps stopping by the florist to pick up a bouquet of her favorite lilies. It was nothing extraordinary, just the mundane, comforting tasks that made up her days. The sun had just started to break through the clouds as she set off, her comfortable sneakers tapping lightly on the sidewalk. She passed familiar faces along the way, exchanging friendly words with the local baker, a wave to the teacher whose children Sarah had watched grow up, and a brief conversation with a neighbor who was out tending his garden. The streets were quiet, save for the distant sound of birds and the occasional car passing by. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel right in the world, the air crisp but not too cold, the kind of morning that seemed to promise nothing out of the ordinary. As Sarah neared the corner where the grocery store stood, she noticed a black SUV parked by the curb. It was an unusual sight in a town where everyone knew each other's vehicles. Sarah didn't think much of it at first, perhaps a visitor or someone from out of town. But then, as she passed the vehicle, a police car pulled up beside her, followed by another. Her steps slowed as she noticed the officers inside the cars, their eyes scanning her as she walked past. Something about their gaze felt unsettling, as though they were watching her a little too closely. She tried to shake off the feeling, assuming it was just her imagination, but it wasn't long before one of the officers stepped out of the car, blocking her path. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said, his voice professional but firm. "We need to speak with you." Sarah, startled by the sudden interruption, smiled politely, assuming it was some kind of misunderstanding. "Is everything all right, officer?" "We just need to ask a few questions," he replied, his tone unwavering. Another officer stepped out of the second car, and before Sarah could process what was happening, they began to move towards her. "Do you mind if we search your bag?" one officer asked, his voice flat and impersonal. Sarah blinked in confusion, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong. Why would you need to search my bag?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at his partner, who had begun to walk around her, eyeing her from all angles. The other officer made no attempt to reassure her, but rather seemed focused on something else, perhaps a preoccupation she couldn't understand. "Ma'am, we need to check your bag," the officer said again, his tone now more insistent. "Please step aside." "I really don't think this is necessary," Sarah said, her voice growing a little shaky. Her mind raced as she tried to process the situation. This wasn't like the peaceful town she knew. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The officers didn't respond to her concerns, and one of them reached forward, unzipping her bag without asking. Sarah took a step back, a feeling of unease growing in her chest. What was happening? Why was this happening? Before she could react further, another officer arrived at the scene, this one a woman, and she quickly joined the others in surrounding Sarah. "We have reason to search you," the woman said briskly, offering no further explanation. "Step over to the car, please." Sarah's mind raced. The officers were now blocking her path, and she was no longer certain of what was happening or why. In the back of her mind, she tried to recall if she had done anything that could have triggered this, but nothing came to mind. Her thoughts jumped to her husband, John. He was the commissioner, surely this couldn't be happening under his watch. Surely, this was some kind of misunderstanding. "Can I call my husband?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling now. The female officer looked at her with a cold gaze. "Not at the moment." Sarah's heart sank as the officers began to rummage through her bag and then her coat, as though they were looking for something specific. It felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. The bustling sounds of the town around her seemed to blur into a distant hum, and for the first time, Sarah felt like an outsider in her own town. Her thoughts spiraled. Was this normal? Could she really not call her husband? She couldn't understand why they were treating her like this. There had to be some sort of mistake. "Is there a warrant for this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, hoping to regain some sense of control. The officers exchanged a look, but the male officer who had first approached her only nodded toward his colleague. "We're just following orders," he said vaguely. Her breath caught in her throat. Something didn't add up. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary search, but something far more deliberate. She tried to steady her breathing as her thoughts raced to John. He was going to be so upset. What was he going to say when he found out? What was happening to her small town? Was this an isolated incident, or was there something more going on? Just as she was about to lose her patience, Sarah caught a glimpse of John's familiar black car in the distance. She felt a rush of relief, a small hope bubbling in her chest. He would make this right, she thought. He was the commissioner, and nothing could happen to her with him here. As John's car approached, Sarah's eyes were drawn to the look of confusion on his face as he saw her standing there, surrounded by officers. He stepped out of the car, and in an instant, the tension in the air shifted. Sarah felt a wave of comfort at the sight of him, but it didn't last long. She knew this wasn't just another day, something was about to change, something that would shake the foundation of her quiet life. As John Montgomery's car screeched to a halt on the quiet street, the weight of the situation settled over Sarah like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her heart beat rapidly in her chest as she caught a glimpse of his face through the windshield. He wasn't yet aware of what was unfolding. He had been on his way back from a meeting with some local law enforcement officials when he saw the scene. His expression, a mixture of concern and confusion, shifted into something more focused as he got out of the car and began walking toward Sarah. "Sarah, what's going on?" John's voice was sharp, his concern unmistakable as he strode toward her, his eyes scanning the surrounding officers. The officers froze for a split second, but it wasn't long before they continued their invasive search. Sarah's heart began to sink as she watched her husband approach, his face tightening with disbelief at the sight of her surrounded by police. Her mind raced with the thought that maybe things could still be resolved, that perhaps this was some sort of misunderstanding, that everything could go back to normal. But deep down, she felt the undeniable weight of something much more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. "John," she whispered, stepping forward, but the officer closest to her blocked her path with his arm. The officer's voice was colder now. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right where you are. We are carrying out a search, and we have reason to believe there's something here that might be illegal." John's eyes narrowed at the officer. The calm demeanor he'd spent years developing as commissioner in their tight-knit town suddenly faded. His training took over, and he stood taller, his posture shifting to one of authority. He knew the law. He knew his rights. And he knew that what was happening to his wife wasn't right. "Hold on just a second," John said sharply, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent years in charge of law enforcement. "You're telling me you're searching my wife without any explanation or consent? I'm the commissioner, and I want to know what's going on here." The officer hesitated but didn't back down. "Sir, we're just following orders. We're not at liberty to share any further information." John took a step closer to the officer, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Orders?" His voice rose, demanding respect. "I don't care about your orders. This is my wife, and you're violating her rights. Now, explain yourselves." Sarah stood frozen, the exchange happening in real time, her stomach twisting in knots. She knew her husband wasn't one to back down in the face of injustice, but this situation was different. Her legs were shaky, her hands trembling. The officer's aggressive stance, their refusal to give clear answers, and now John's confrontational tone, they were all pushing her deeper into a state of panic. A third officer, one who had been observing from the sidelines, approached cautiously. "We're doing our job, sir. We have reason to believe that the search is necessary. We have information that," he trailed off as if he was unsure how to proceed. Sarah's heart sank as she caught his words. Information. Was this all based on some vague tip? What kind of information? Had someone made an accusation, or was this a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? She looked from officer to officer, trying to find any trace of reason or compassion in their faces, but there was nothing. They were distant, robotic, as though their minds were made up long before they even approached her. John noticed the change in his wife's demeanor. He stepped forward, trying to keep his cool. His voice dropped lower but was laced with authority, every word sharp and deliberate. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this stops now. I'm calling this off." One of the officers, a tall man with a rigid posture, turned to his partner with a raised eyebrow. He seemed to hesitate for the briefest of moments before speaking, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The officer who had been nearest to Sarah, now seemingly more nervous than before, exchanged a glance with the other two. Finally, the man who had been the most vocal earlier spoke again, his tone more guarded this time. "We're not here to cause trouble, sir. But we have to finish this search." Sarah could feel her breath quickening, the unease in the pit of her stomach growing with every passing second. She could see the gears turning in John's mind, the fire in his eyes when he realized that something deeper was at play here. This wasn't just an ordinary search. This wasn't routine. Something was wrong. Very wrong. John's expression hardened, and he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the district attorney. I'm going to get to the bottom of this right now." Sarah could feel her knees weakening as she stood there, powerless. She wanted to scream, to yell at the officers to stop, but all she could do was stand and watch as her husband fought for control of the situation. This was his job, his life, but now it was personal. It was his family that was being humiliated, that was being pushed around. Her whole body trembled with a mix of fear, helplessness, and anger. As John began dialing his phone, the female officer who had been standing to the side stepped forward. "Sir, please," she said, her voice softer than the others, but there was no compassion in her eyes. "We don't want to escalate this further. We just need to complete the search." Sarah was now numb. She felt as though her life had been put on hold, frozen in this bizarre, tense moment. Was she really standing here, being treated like a criminal? It made no sense. John snapped his phone closed, his voice steady but dripping with authority. "That's it," he said. "This ends now. I'm pulling rank. If you want to search my wife, you will need a warrant, and you will have to explain why you're doing this. This is not how we operate in my town, and it is certainly not how we treat people." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sarah could hear the distant murmur of voices from neighbors peeking through their windows, wondering what was going on. The hum of the town seemed so far away now, like a fading memory, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. Just as John finished speaking, one of the officers let out an audible sigh and looked at his partner. The air shifted, as though something was about to give. Finally, the officer who had remained mostly silent stepped forward and said in a voice that was almost apologetic, "We were acting on a tip from an anonymous source, sir. We didn't mean to cause you any distress. But we had to investigate." The word struck Sarah like a slap in the face. An anonymous tip? This entire scene, this nightmare, was based on someone's unverified claim? Her hands clenched at her sides as the disbelief settled over her. The officers had invaded her privacy, her space, without any concrete reason, and now they were admitting it? John's face tightened with barely contained rage. An anonymous tip? And you're telling me that gives you the right to treat my wife this way? No explanation, no due process, just a free pass to violate her rights? The officer who had spoken earlier seemed to flinch, and Sarah noticed how uncomfortable the situation had become for them. They hadn't expected the commissioner's presence to carry this much weight. But in the pit of her stomach, Sarah could feel the bitterness rise. This wasn't about what was right or wrong, it was about power. The officers had overstepped their boundaries, and now, as they faced the consequences of their actions, they were scrambling to justify their mistakes. The female officer, sensing the shift in control, looked down at the ground before finally saying, "We'll be leaving now, sir. We apologize for the inconvenience." But even as she spoke, Sarah couldn't help but feel like something far more sinister had just been revealed. The officers packed up their things and slowly retreated to their cars, their presence still lingering like an unsolved mystery. John turned to Sarah, his face filled with a mixture of anger and regret. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now as he reached for her hand. Sarah nodded weakly, but she could still feel the sting of what had just happened. Something inside her had been broken, and she knew this was only the beginning. Their life in this quiet town would never be the same again. The quiet hum of the town returned as the last of the officers' vehicles drove away, but for Sarah and John, the peaceful morning they had both imagined seemed like a distant memory. Sarah could feel the knot in her stomach tighten even as John held her close, trying to comfort her in the midst of a storm she couldn't have predicted. The scene had left her feeling exposed, violated, like a stranger in her own town. The officers had come, they had invaded her privacy, and they had left with nothing but vague excuses and a trail of unanswered questions. As they stood there on the sidewalk, the air thick with unspoken tension, John's thoughts were racing. He was still trying to process what had just happened. An anonymous tip? The idea gnawed at him. What was it that they had been looking for? Why had they targeted Sarah, and why had they gone so far? His mind flashed back to the police force he had spent years building, a force that had always prided itself on its professionalism, its integrity, and its commitment to justice. This wasn't just a slip-up, it was a breach of everything he had worked for. "Sarah, we need to talk," John said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. "I need you to stay calm. We're going to figure this out, but we need to take a step back first." Sarah nodded, but her mind felt like it was spinning out of control. She had never been the type to get involved in town politics, but this event, this intrusion, was pulling her into something much bigger than herself. She had always been the supportive wife, the one who stayed in the background while John handled the difficult decisions, but now, everything had changed. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her life turned upside down by the actions of those who were supposed to protect her. "John, I don't understand. What is going on? Why would they search me like that? What do they think I did?" Sarah's voice trembled, but her need for answers pushed her forward. John sighed deeply, his hand resting on her shoulder as he tried to find the right words. "I don't know. I really don't. But what I do know is that someone is trying to make a statement, and they've gone through great lengths to make sure we're paying attention. This isn't just about you, Sarah. This is about something much larger than us, something that could shake the entire town. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You mean, this is some kind of setup? John paused, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He hadn't wanted to jump to conclusions, but everything he had seen in the past few minutes pointed to something far more calculated than just a random search. It's possible, he said quietly. This could be a targeted attempt to undermine my position as commissioner, to make us question everything we've worked for. And it's not just about us, it's about the trust people place in me, in the system. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with the weight of unspoken fears and uncertain futures. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered. Why had the police acted so recklessly? Why had they ignored the basic principles of justice? And why had Sarah been caught in the crossfire? John, Sarah said softly, breaking the silence, I don't want to be part of some game. I don't want our lives to be turned upside down because of something we can't control. Her voice cracked, the raw emotion she had been holding back now spilling out. This is not what I signed up for. John's grip on her tightened, a mix of sympathy and resolve in his eyes. I know, Sarah. I know. But we're in this together. And we'll fight to make sure the truth comes out. Over the next few hours, the weight of the morning's events continued to hang over them like a storm cloud. Sarah's mind was still reeling, but John's calm, authoritative demeanor seemed to anchor her in the chaos. He called in every favor he could, reaching out to his colleagues in the district attorney's office, as well as some trusted friends in higher positions, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. But each conversation only deepened the mystery. No one seemed to know exactly what had triggered the search, or why Sarah had been targeted specifically. There was no explanation, no justification, just a lingering sense of something sinister brewing just beneath the surface. As the afternoon wore on, the couple found themselves sitting together in their living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt cold and distant, as if the events of the morning had somehow seeped into the walls. Sarah's eyes were red from the tears she hadn't been able to hold back, and John's face was drawn, the exhaustion of trying to make sense of everything taking its toll. I can't stop thinking about it, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. Why didn't they tell us anything? Why did they treat me like a criminal? John rubbed his temples, trying to push away the headache that had been building all day. I don't know, Sarah. And that's what's bothering me. This wasn't just an isolated incident. Someone wanted us to know that we're vulnerable. They wanted to send a message. The silence between them stretched for a long moment, and then, finally, John spoke again, his voice more determined this time. We can't let this go, Sarah. We have to find out who is behind this. We can't let them win. Just as he finished speaking, the phone rang, breaking the tension in the room. John's hand shot out instinctively to grab the receiver. His eyes narrowed as he listened, his brow furrowing in concentration. Sarah could hear the low murmur of the conversation, but she couldn't make out the words. Then, suddenly, John's voice sharpened. What do you mean, you don't have anything? His tone was incredulous. This is a matter of public record, not some secret you can hide. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she watched him, the urgency in his voice pulling her to her feet. She paced anxiously across the room, trying to make sense of the situation. Finally, John hung up the phone with a frustrated sigh. Who was it? Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. It was one of my contacts at the DA's office, John replied, rubbing his temples in frustration. They're telling me there's no record of a warrant for the search. No paperwork filed. Nothing. It's like it never happened. Sarah's mind spun. No warrant? No justification? The more she tried to process it, the less sense it made. So what does that mean? Are they just making this up? John's jaw clenched, his eyes cold with determination. It means someone went rogue, Sarah. And that someone is trying to cover their tracks. They're trying to keep this under wraps, but I'm not going to let them. The air in the room was thick with tension. Sarah's thoughts whirled. She had been in the dark for too long, and now, more than ever, she needed to understand what was happening. Who was behind this? Why had they targeted her? And what was their endgame? As the evening settled in and the town around them grew quiet, Sarah and John knew that this was only the beginning. The search may have ended, but the real battle was just beginning. The shadow of doubt had been cast over their lives, and now they had to fight to get it back. The consequences of the day's events would ripple through their lives, their town, and their future. But the one thing they both knew for sure was that they weren't going to back down. Together, they would uncover the truth. And nothing, not even the fear of what might come next, would stop them from getting it. The days following the search were an uneasy blur for Sarah and John. Despite the initial shock, the reality of the situation began to settle in like a storm cloud on the horizon. Each conversation, each attempt to gather more information, only deepened their confusion and unease. The search had left an undeniable stain on their lives, one that wasn't easily washed away by official apologies or the town's usual quiet hum. They could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on them, and the silence around them began to grow deafening. John's every move seemed to be scrutinized, and he noticed the subtle shift in the way people interacted with him. The once steadfast support he had received from the townsfolk was now laced with suspicion. Whispers followed him wherever he went. The whispers weren't just about him, they were about Sarah, about their marriage, about their very place in the community. People had questions, and they weren't afraid to ask, but no one seemed to have answers. As the week wore on, John couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. He had spent enough time in law enforcement to know when things didn't add up. The search had been more than a mistake, it was a carefully orchestrated move to throw him off balance, to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those who depended on him. But who would benefit from such a move? Who would want to destroy the commissioner's credibility? It was a question that gnawed at him every waking moment. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings with local law enforcement and frustrated calls to his contacts at the DA's office, John sat down in their kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand. He had spoken to everyone he could think of, and every lead had turned up nothing. The search seemed to have been carried out without any clear authorization, yet no one in the department was willing to admit that something had gone wrong. Even worse, there was no paperwork to track down. No one could explain who had called for the search, or why it had happened at all. The feeling of being in the dark, of being out of control, was unbearable. Sarah, sensing the tension building in the room, entered the kitchen quietly. She could see the exhaustion on his face, the frustration in his posture. She had always known John to be someone who handled challenges head-on, but this situation was different. There were no answers, no clear path forward. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces didn't fit. "John, what's going on?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "You've been on the phone all day. We need to figure out what happened, but I can see it's eating you up." John looked up at her, his eyes tired, but there was a resolve in them that she hadn't seen in days. "I'm not going to rest until I know the truth, Sarah," he said, his voice low but determined. "I've been in this job long enough to know when I'm being played. This isn't just some random mistake. Someone is pulling the strings here, and they're using you to get to me." Sarah's heart sank at his words. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. She had thought that if they just waited long enough, the situation would blow over. But now it was clear that the forces at work were far more insidious than she had imagined. She wasn't just caught in the middle, she was being used as a pawn in a game that she didn't understand. "They've been watching us, Sarah," John continued, his voice thick with frustration. "Whoever is behind this knows our every move. They knew exactly when to strike, when to make their play. The search wasn't about finding anything. It was about shaking me, making me second-guess myself. A chill ran through Sarah as she processed his words. This wasn't just an ordinary threat. Whoever had orchestrated this knew how to get under John's skin, how to make him feel vulnerable. They weren't trying to get information from Sarah, they were trying to destabilize John's position, to weaken him in front of the very people who trusted him. They want to break me, John said, more to himself than to Sarah. But they don't know who they're dealing with. Sarah knew her husband well enough to know that once he set his mind on something, there was no stopping him. But this wasn't just a matter of solving a crime or finding a culprit. It was personal. They had gone after his family. And that was something John could never let go. John, Sarah said, her voice steadied despite the storm swirling in her chest. You don't have to do this alone. We're in this together, remember? John looked at her, his eyes softening for just a moment. I know, Sarah. I know. But I can't let you be dragged into this. This is bigger than us. And I need to protect you. Sarah shook her head, her expression firm. I don't need protecting, John. I need answers. We need answers. I can't sit here and wonder what's going to happen next. We have to fight back. Together. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had always been the protector, the one who took the burden of responsibility upon himself. But Sarah was right. They were in this together. And if he was going to take on the people who had orchestrated this, he needed her strength just as much as his own. All right, he said, the fire in his eyes reigniting. Let's do this. Let's find out who's behind this, and let's make them pay. The next few days were filled with a quiet determination that neither Sarah nor John could ignore. They dug into every lead they could find, each step leading them deeper into a web of intrigue and deception that seemed to grow by the day. Sarah's role, despite her initial reluctance, became crucial in gathering information. She wasn't just the wife of the commissioner anymore, she was a partner in the investigation, sifting through the clues and contacts John couldn't reach. It didn't take long before they discovered something unsettling. An anonymous tip, which had been the catalyst for the entire search, had originated from someone who had once been close to John, someone from his past, a name he hadn't heard in years. The revelation sent a shockwave through both of them. This wasn't some random act. This wasn't just a misguided attempt to undermine his authority. It was personal. The person behind it was someone who knew John intimately, someone who had a deep-seated grudge. John's thoughts were chaotic as he tried to piece together the motive. He thought back to the time before he became commissioner, before he had been swept up in the politics of the town. There had been people he had crossed, decisions he had made that had left others in his wake. But had it really come to this? Had someone from his past been biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike? As they continued to investigate, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It became clear that the search had been a calculated attempt to discredit John. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized that the conspiracy was much larger than just one person. There were others involved, others who had orchestrated the entire situation, who had worked behind the scenes to sow distrust and chaos. This was no longer just a battle between John and an old foe. It was a fight for the very soul of the town, for its future. With each new piece of information, Sarah and John found themselves facing a growing web of corruption and deceit. The enemy they were up against wasn't just out for revenge, it was out for power. They weren't just trying to destroy John's career. They were trying to reshape everything, using whatever means necessary. As the pressure mounted, the Montgomerys realized that they were standing at the precipice of something far bigger than they had imagined. The stakes were higher now. They were no longer just fighting for their own lives and reputations. They were fighting for the future of the town itself. But as the truth began to surface, Sarah and John knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't back down. They couldn't afford. The tension in the Montgomery household was palpable as Sarah and John continued to piece together the shattering reality of what they were up against. The more they uncovered, the more the stakes grew. Their investigation had started with the invasive search of Sarah's home, a personal attack that had initially seemed like an isolated incident. But as days turned into weeks, it became increasingly clear that what they were facing wasn't a single rogue officer, or even a disgruntled former colleague. It was a vast, coordinated effort, one that reached into the very heart of the town, threatening to unravel everything John had worked for. John was no stranger to difficult situations. He had been a police officer for years, and during that time, he had seen the darker side of human nature. But this was something different. It was one thing to face off against criminals on the street, but to find yourself trapped in a web of manipulation and deceit within your own ranks, within the very system you had spent your life building and protecting, was something else entirely. It was a betrayal that ran so deep it felt like a wound to his soul. Every phone call they made, every document they reviewed, seemed to lead them down a new rabbit hole, revealing connections and alliances they hadn't even suspected. The old, quiet town that had once seemed so peaceful was now a place of secrets and shadows, where loyalty was a rare commodity and the truth was a commodity no one seemed willing to trade. The deeper they dug, the more they realized that those who had set their sights on John and Sarah were not just interested in destroying his career. They wanted to break him, to force him to make a choice, either fall in line with their corrupt system or watch everything he had fought for crumble to dust. Rd2. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the file in front of him. The information they had gathered so far was like a jigsaw puzzle with too many missing pieces. He had tracked down a list of names, some familiar, some not, and each one seemed to be connected to the same mysterious benefactor, someone who had orchestrated the entire operation. But as he stared at the names, one stood out: Edward Lane. Edward Lane had once been John's mentor. A man who had taught him everything he knew about law enforcement, about duty, and about the delicate balance of power and responsibility. When John had first started his career, Lane had been there to guide him, to give him the wisdom of his years of experience. But that was before everything changed. Lane had retired early, citing personal reasons, but John had always suspected that there was more to the story. Now, seeing his name at the center of this web, John's suspicions were confirmed. "What are you thinking?" Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She had entered the room silently, a cup of coffee in her hand. Her face was tired, but there was a steely determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I think we need to talk to Edward," John said, his voice low. "I think he's the key to everything." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she didn't hesitate. "You think he's behind this?" "I don't know," John replied, his fingers tapping on the file in front of him. "But his name keeps coming up. It's no coincidence. There's something going on, something bigger than just a few bad apples in the department. Lane has the connections, the resources. If anyone knows who's pulling the strings, it's him." The thought of confronting Edward Lane was a difficult one for John. Lane had been a father figure to him in many ways, a man he had respected and looked up to. The idea that this man, this mentor, could be involved in something so sinister was almost too much to bear. But John knew that he couldn't afford to let personal feelings cloud his judgment. He had to get to the bottom of this, no matter where it led. The next morning, John made the call. The conversation was brief, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Lane agreed to meet, but he was careful with his words, as if he already knew that the game had changed. They set the time and place, an old diner on the outskirts of town. It was neutral ground, far enough away from prying eyes to ensure that their conversation wouldn't be overheard. When John and Sarah arrived, the diner was nearly empty. The smell of stale coffee and burnt toast lingered in the air, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, artificial glow over the room. They sat in a booth, waiting for Lane to arrive. Sarah's fingers tapped nervously on the table, her eyes darting between John and the door, as if expecting Lane to appear at any moment. The silence between them was thick, full of unspoken thoughts and fears. Neither of them knew what to expect from this meeting, but they both knew it was crucial. Everything hinged on this conversation. Finally, the door opened, and in walked Edward Lane. He was older than John remembered, his face lined with years of hard living, but there was still something about him that exuded authority. His eyes scanned the room quickly, settling on John and Sarah before he made his way to the booth. He didn't smile, didn't offer any pleasantries, he simply sat down across from them, his hands folding neatly in front of him. "John," Lane said, his voice low and measured. "It's been a long time." John nodded, but he didn't offer a handshake. There was too much at stake for pleasantries. "I didn't expect to see you again," John said bluntly. "Not like this." Lane's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to John. "I'm sure you didn't. But I'm not the one who came looking for answers. You too," he gestured vaguely between them, "have dug into something you shouldn't have." Sarah leaned forward, her voice sharp. "We know you're involved, Edward. We know you're behind this." Lane's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes hardened. "You don't know anything," he said, his tone carrying a note of warning. "You think you've uncovered something, but you're just scratching the surface. If you're smart, you'll drop this before it's too late." John's jaw clenched. He had always trusted Lane, but that trust was slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. "What are you talking about?" "You've been playing us, Edward. You've been using us as pawns in some game, and I'm done being your fool." Lane's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "You're naive, John. You always have been. This town, this whole operation, it's bigger than you think. And you're in the middle of it now. There's no way out." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from Lane's lips made it all too real. "What do you want from us?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear she was feeling. "What's the endgame here?" Lane's eyes flickered briefly, then he leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "The endgame," he echoed, as if the concept were something laughable. "You think this is just about you, John? About me? No, this is about power. Control. And now you've become part of the game." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She could see the darkness in Lane's eyes now, the ruthlessness that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. He wasn't just a retired officer, he was a man who had been pulling strings from the shadows for years. And now, they were all tangled up in his web. "You don't have to do this," John said, his voice filled with a mix of anger and desperation. "You can stop this. Help us bring everything to light. We'll expose them." Lane's expression softened for a fraction of a second, but the moment passed quickly. He leaned forward, locking eyes with John. "You can't win, John. You never could. You were always a pawn, just like the rest of us. And now, you'll pay the price." The words lingered in the air like a death sentence, hanging over them as the reality of their situation set in. They weren't just fighting for their own lives anymore, they were fighting for the very future of the town. And against a man like Edward Lane, who had been in control for so long, they were going to need more than just courage. They needed to outsmart him, outplay him. And that meant they had to be willing to risk everything. As Lane stood up to leave, he offered one final piece of advice. "I gave you a chance, John. Don't say I didn't warn you." The door closed behind him, and the silence in the diner seemed to settle like dust around them. They were in it now. There was no turning back. They had to expose Lane and the people pulling the strings behind him, no matter the cost. It was no longer about just clearing their names. It was about saving their town from the web of corruption that had festered for too long. But the real battle was only just beginning, and John and Sarah knew that they were up against an enemy that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The confrontation with Edward Lane had left a deep scar on both John and Sarah, but it had also ignited a fire within them. As Lane's parting words echoed in their minds, they knew the fight wasn't just about clearing their names anymore, it was a battle for their very survival. The stakes had escalated beyond anything they had imagined. The town, the people they had once trusted, now seemed like strangers, and the lines between friend and foe were blurred beyond recognition. For days, they avoided the obvious course of action. Sarah and John didn't want to alert anyone else just yet. If they started pointing fingers or making accusations before they had all the facts, it would only serve to tarnish their credibility even more. They were walking on a tightrope, and one wrong step could send them plummeting into an abyss of scandal and ruin. They had to be careful, patient, and strategic. Every decision, every move had to be calculated, not just for the truth, but for their very survival in the volatile world they had been thrust into. John spent long hours alone in his office, reviewing old files and scanning through dozens of reports, all while keeping a careful eye on his back. Lane's warning still haunted him, and though John wanted to believe there was some way out, part of him couldn't shake the feeling that they were up against something far larger than a few corrupt officials. The more he searched for answers, the deeper the web of corruption seemed to grow. The phone calls to his colleagues became less frequent, and when he did reach them, the conversation was stilted, as if everyone was suddenly wary of him, of what he might know. The unease wasn't just in John's office, it was everywhere. The once familiar streets of the town now felt foreign. He had always known that the public had a certain respect for the commissioner's position, but that respect had quickly turned into something more akin to suspicion. John could feel the whispers everywhere, and he knew that the longer this went on, the more people would start taking sides. They would have to act fast, but how? Who could they trust? They had come so far, but the question now wasn't just about who was behind the plot. It was whether they could outmaneuver those who had already anticipated their every move. Days turned into weeks as the investigation into Lane's involvement continued, and each new piece of information felt like another brick in a wall they were trying to tear down. Sarah had been relentless in her pursuit of answers. Her mind, sharp and focused, became a crucial asset in piecing together the puzzle. She had long since shed her role as just the wife of the commissioner. She was now a key player in their shared mission. What had started as a personal vendetta against her had quickly become a battle for the town's soul, and Sarah wasn't about to back down. Through her quiet, methodical research, Sarah uncovered a disturbing pattern. Lane's ties to the town's political elite went far deeper than they had initially imagined. His influence reached into nearly every corner of local government, the police force, and even the private sector. John had always known Lane was a powerful man, but he had no idea just how deep his roots ran. It was as if Lane had built a system within the system, one that was nearly impossible to unravel. And as Sarah dug deeper, she found evidence of transactions, meetings, and covert deals that seemed to suggest a much larger conspiracy, one that involved not just Lane, but several high-ranking officials who had been working together to control the flow of power and money in the town. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous their situation became. Sarah's discoveries weren't just threatening to expose the truth, they were also putting them in the crosshairs of those who had the most to lose. There were whispers of intimidation, of people who had mysteriously disappeared, of families who had been threatened into silence. There were even rumors that the investigation had already cost one officer his job, his reputation ruined after he had tried to speak out against the corruption. The stakes were higher than ever, and now it wasn't just about clearing their names, it was about taking down a network of power that had been operating in the shadows for years. But despite the mounting threats and the growing sense of danger, John and Sarah refused to back down. They knew that they were the only ones who could expose the truth. No one else seemed willing to take on the task, too many were too close to the power structure to risk their positions. If they wanted to bring down Lane and the others involved, they would have to do it themselves. They would have to be smart, careful, and above all, they would have to act quickly. One night, as they pored over the evidence, John suddenly froze, his eyes scanning a particular report over and over again. Something about it didn't sit right with him. A name had popped up again, Edward Lane's. But this time, the report wasn't about his influence in local politics. It was about a transaction, one that had been quietly buried in the midst of a larger deal. It was a bribe, a payoff that had been made to ensure that certain information remained hidden, to ensure that a deal between two parties would go through without a hitch. The document didn't just implicate Lane, it implicated some of the town's most influential figures. And it wasn't just about money, it was about power, about consolidating control over every aspect of the town's operations. John's heart pounded in his chest. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, the smoking gun they needed to bring down the entire operation. But there was a catch: if they went public with this information now, they would risk everything. Lane and the others were too powerful, too entrenched. They would do whatever it took to protect themselves, even if it meant silencing John and Sarah permanently. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy and caution. John and Sarah knew they had to take this evidence to someone they could trust, someone outside of the corrupted system. They had considered going to the press, but that would risk everything they had uncovered. No, they needed someone who had the power to act without being swayed by the forces that were trying to silence them. It was then that John thought of an old friend, a former colleague from his early days as a cop. Jack Reynolds had left the force years ago, but he had built a reputation as a tireless investigator, someone who had always sought justice, no matter the cost. If anyone could help them navigate the treacherous waters they found themselves in, it was Jack. They reached out to him quietly, and after a few tense days of waiting, he agreed to meet. The meeting was set for an isolated cabin just outside of town, far from prying eyes. When they arrived, Jack was waiting for them, his expression unreadable. They wasted no time in getting to the point. They laid everything out for him, the evidence, the names, the connections. Jack listened carefully, his eyes never leaving the papers before him. When they were finished, Jack looked up at them. "This is bigger than you realize," he said quietly. "But it's not impossible to take down. The people behind this have been operating in the dark for years, but the truth always comes to light eventually. The question is, are you prepared to fight for it?" John and Sarah exchanged a look. This was it, the point of no return. There was no going back now. But they both knew that they couldn't stop. They couldn't let Lane and his network win. They had to keep pushing forward, no matter what the cost. With Jack's help, they began to formulate a plan, one that would require everything they had. They would have to be strategic, they would have to move quickly, and they would have to stay one step ahead of their enemies at all times. But for the first time in weeks, John felt a spark of hope. They weren't alone anymore. With Jack by their side, they had a chance to bring the truth to light, to expose the corruption that had poisoned their town for so long. But as they began to put their plan into motion, they knew that this was only the beginning. The fight ahead would be long, and the consequences would be far-reaching. But they were ready for whatever came next. They had already lost so much, now, they had nothing left to do but fight. And fight they would.